Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I'll start with what I do, because what I do is the only reason any of this matters. I'm a materials analyst, independent contractor, 20 years in, specializing in core sample analysis from deep drilling operations. What that means in practical terms is that when a drill bit comes back up from somewhere nobody has ever been, trailing a cylinder of rock pulled from depths that would kill a person in seconds, I'm the one who holds that rock and tells people what it is, what it's made of, how old it is, what the conditions were like where it formed. I'm the translator between the deep, unvisited parts of the planet and the people who need to know what's down there before they build something on top of it or drill further into it or make financial decisions about it. My name is Imogen Vass. I'm 48 years old and I work out of a converted workshop on my property in upstate New York that I've spent 15 years turning into a better analysis setup than most university labs I've been inside. I have a daughter named Sarah, 23, urban planner in Seattle, calls me on Sundays. I have a professional coordinator named Bram, who's been routing my contracted work for 12 years and whose judgment about which projects are worth taking I trust more than my own. The work I do requires precision and patience, and the ability to look at something that came from a place no human being has ever been and tell people exactly what it is. I'm good at it. I've been good at it for 20 years. I don't say that as pride exactly, more as context for what follows, because what follows is going to sound like the work of someone who doesn't know what she's looking at, and I need you to understand that's not what it is. I know what I'm looking at. I just don't have a category for it. The contract came through Bram on a Tuesday morning with documentation that was thinner than it should have been for a project of the scope described. The client was listed as a private geological research consortium I hadn't heard of, which wasn't unusual in itself, since there were dozens of well-funded private research operations I hadn't heard of, and the industry didn't require them to advertise. The borehole location was listed as Central Asia, which was vague enough to be slightly unusual, but not unheard of for a project with sensitive land rights considerations. The listed borehole depth was 12 miles. I read it twice and then called Bram and told him there was a decimal point error in the documentation. He said there wasn't. I said 12 miles was beyond anything officially attempted. The deepest borehole on record was a Soviet project, the Kola Super Deep Borehole, which had reached just over 7.5 miles before they'd had to abandon it, because the rock at that depth was behaving differently than the models predicted, becoming hot and plastic and difficult to drill through in ways they hadn't anticipated. Bram said he understood and that the consortium had been aware of the Kola project and had apparently solved the technical problems it ran into, and that the contract paid exceptionally well, and he thought I should take it. I took it. The samples arrived 4 days later in a sealed transport case with a detailed inventory list and handling instructions and a project protocol document that told me what analyses were required and what format the report should take. Standard stuff, professionally assembled. Whatever the consortium was, they'd done this before. I signed for the case and took it into the workroom and opened it. The upper samples were exactly what I'd expect from the depth range they came from. Metamorphic rock, heavily modified by pressure and heat. The mineral composition consistent with lower crustal material. I'm talking about rock that had spent billions of years under the weight of everything above it, compressed to the point where the minerals had recrystallized into new forms, where the original character of the material was almost completely overwritten by what it had been through since. Old rock, dense, dark, deformed in the beautiful systematic way that extreme pressure deforms things, foliation patterns, and mineral alignment that told a readable story about forces and time. I catalogued them methodically. It was satisfying work, the way all this work is satisfying. The clarity of it, the way the material tells you what it is if you know how to ask. Then I got to the deep samples. The change started gradually. At a certain point in the depth sequence, the grain structure of the rock began to look different. Not different in composition. The minerals were still what I'd expect, but different in arrangement. In naturally formed rock, the mineral crystals grow and arrange themselves according to local conditions, pressure gradients, and temperature, and the presence of fluids, and a dozen other variables that produce the beautiful organized randomness of geological material. There's structure to it, but it's the structure of accumulated process, not intention. These crystals were oriented, all of them, across multiple samples from the deepest sections of the borehole. The crystalline structures were aligned toward a single direction, the way iron filings align in a magnetic field, except these minerals weren't magnetic, and there was no magnetic field that would produce this effect at this depth. Something had been influencing the formation of this rock as it crystallized consistently from a single direction for as long as this rock had been rock. I spent an afternoon on those samples, making sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. I was seeing it. I set them aside and moved to the final sample, the deepest one, the last material the drill bit had touched before the operation apparently ended. It was different from all the others. Along one side of the cylindrical sample, running its full length, was an indentation, smooth, curved, precise in the way that machined surfaces are precise, not the irregular surface of rock against rock, but the clean geometry of contact with something that had a defined and consistent shape. The drill bit had grazed something. At 12 miles depth, it had touched something, and what it had touched had left its impression on the rock the drill brought back up. I held the sample under my magnifier for a long time. The curved surface of the indentation was so clean it was almost reflective. I ran my full battery of tests on the final sample, and I am going to describe the results the way I described them in a report, because that's how I process things, and because the clinical language does something the other kind of language doesn't, which is keep the findings from getting away from you. First, I checked the contact surface for contamination from the drill bit material. When a drill bit grazes something at depth, the contact transfers material both ways. The drill leaves residue on what it touches, and what it touches leaves residue on the drill. The contact surface showed no drill material. Whatever the object was, the drill hadn't marked it. The contact had marked the drill instead. I analyzed the residue on the drill side of the contact. the microscopic debris transferred from the object's surface. The drill bit was a tungsten carbide composite, standard for ultra-deep operations, and I expected to find tool steel wear products with trace tungsten. I found those. I also found something else, a trace material from the object's surface. I ran it through every reference database I have access to, which is more comprehensive than most because I've spent 20 years building up the access and the libraries. No match, not a mineral, not an alloy, not a synthetic composite, not anything in the geological record, and not anything in the materials science literature I could reach. The crystalline structure was unlike any known material. The density was unlike any known material. I measured the density 3 times because the first result seemed like an equipment error. It wasn't an equipment error. The material was denser than osmium, which is the densest naturally occurring element on Earth, and denser than any synthetic material I could locate a record of, not by a small margin, by a significant one. I emailed the spectroscopic data to a materials scientist I trusted, a man named Dr. Theo Alt at a university in Michigan, who I'd collaborated with on 2 previous projects. I didn't tell him where the sample came from. I just told him I had an unclassified material and asked if he could take a look. He called me back in 2 days, which was fast for Theo, who was thorough to the point of being slow. He said he didn't have a classification for what I'd sent him. He asked where the sample came from, and I told him a deep drilling project. He asked how deep. I told him. There was a pause that lasted long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Then he said he'd like to see the original sample and asked if that was possible. I told him I'd think about it. After I hung up, I dated the rock from the contact zone, the rock immediately surrounding where the drill had grazed the object. I used multiple methods because I wanted the result to be solid. The result came back the same across all methods. 4.4 billion years old. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. In the first 100 million years of the planet's existence, the surface was largely molten, the crust just beginning to form as the planet cooled from the violence of its formation. The rock around this object had formed during that period. In the early cooling, in the first uncertain solidification of a planet that hadn't yet decided what it was going to be. The object had been there during that. It hadn't been buried. There was no surface to bury it from, no solid ground above it to dig down through and place something and cover it back up. The planet had cooled around it. It was here first. I called Bram that evening and I told him what I'd found. I gave it to him in sequence: the anomalous crystalline orientation, the contact evidence, the unclassified surface material, the density result, the dating. I laid it out the way I always lay things out for Bram, methodically and without editorializing, and I let him hear it in order. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me something he hadn't mentioned when he routed the contract. He said this wasn't the first set of samples from this project he'd been asked to route. 6 months ago, there'd been a first batch that he'd sent to another analyst, a geochemist named Perry, who I knew professionally. Perry was experienced and reliable, the kind of person whose reports you could cite without double-checking his methodology, because his methodology was always sound. Perry had submitted a partial report and then gone quiet. Bram had been unable to reach him for several weeks. Eventually, He'd gotten a short message from Perry saying he was taking an extended leave and withdrawing from the project. No explanation. I asked Bram if he'd read Perry's partial report. He said yes. I asked what Perry had found. He said Perry's report had documented the same anomalies I had described in the same order, through the same findings, and had stopped. The last entry was a single line. It said the object appeared to be geometrically perfect and that Perry needed time to verify this before submitting. I stayed with that for a moment. I asked Bram what geometrically perfect meant in the context of what we were discussing. He said he thought it meant what it sounded like it meant, and that he'd been sitting on it for 6 months, not knowing what to do with it. I asked if the consortium had been in touch about any of this. He said the consortium had stopped responding to his messages about 12 weeks ago. The project account was still active. Payment on my contract had cleared, but no human being on the client side had responded to anything in 3 months. We stayed on the phone without saying anything for a moment. Then I said I needed to go back to my samples. He said, okay. I went back to my samples. I approached the contact surface differently now. Perry's finding gave me a specific thing to look for, and I looked for it with the same precision I brought to everything else. Because if something is worth knowing, it's worth knowing accurately. The curved indentation in the final core sample was a precise physical record of the object's surface at the point of contact. The curvature was preserved in the impression the way a mold preserves the shape of what formed it. If I could measure the curvature precisely enough, I could calculate the radius of the object. The radius would give me the diameter. The diameter would tell me what I was dealing with in geometric terms. I measured the curvature of the contact surface at 32 points along its length using the highest resolution imaging I had available. I ran the calculation. The radius was consistent across all 32 measurement points. Not approximately consistent. Not within the kind of acceptable tolerance range that manufactured objects achieve through good engineering. Exactly consistent. The same radius at every point I measured, to the limit of my instrument's precision to distinguish. The curvature didn't vary, not once, not by any measurable amount. The surface the drill had grazed was a perfect sphere. I calculated the diameter from the radius, approximately 230 feet, sitting at 12 miles depth in a rock that had formed around it 4.4 billion years ago. Perfectly spherical to a degree of precision that no natural geological process has ever produced, and that no manufactured object I knew of achieved at anything approaching that scale. I spent the next 2 days working through everything the evidence could tell me about the object. The density of the surface material was far beyond any known substance. The sphere itself, extrapolating from the surface material and the density, would be inconceivably massive for its size, massive enough that its gravitational influence on the material immediately surrounding it during the early cooling of the crust would be measurable. I looked at the crystalline orientation data from the surrounding rock samples again. The oriented crystal structures I'd found, the unusual alignment I'd noticed in the deep samples, were pointing toward the sphere. The rock that had formed around the object 4.4 billion years ago had been influenced by its presence as it crystallized. The sphere had been sitting there in the dark and the heat and the early chaos of a cooling planet, and it had been doing something to the rock forming above it, quietly, consistently, for 4.5 billion years. Not aggressively, not in any way the surface would ever register, or that any geologist reading the rock record from above would ever identify unless they were looking at a core sample from directly above the object itself. Just a subtle, constant influence on the material around it, like tuning something, like slowly and patiently adjusting something over an incomprehensible span of time. I sat at my work table with all of this laid out in front of me, and I thought about what you have to be, what kind of thing you have to be, to place something with that precision before a planet exists and have the planet form around it the way you'd expected it to. I thought about the word left, as in whatever placed it here left. I sat with the word for a while. I wasn't sure left was right. I called Sarah on Sunday the way I always do. She told me about her week, a project she was working on for the city, a rezoning proposal she'd been put on that was more complicated than it looked, a trip she was planning in the spring with 2 friends from college, somewhere in Portugal. She'd been wanting to go for a few years. I listened and asked questions, and I was as present in the conversation as I'd been in anything for 2 weeks, which is to say more present than I'd been in the work, because the work had been pulling some part of my attention down into it in a way I couldn't fully close off. Near the end of the call, she asked how work was going. I said it was interesting. She asked interesting how. I said I'd found something in a core sample that I didn't have a good explanation for. She asked what kind of something. I said an object. Very deep, very old, very precisely made. She was quiet for a moment. I know Sarah's silences the way you know the silences of someone you've been talking to since before they had words. This one was the silence of someone deciding how to ask a question they weren't sure they wanted the answer to. She asked carefully, made by who? I said I didn't know. She asked if it was the kind of thing that had a normal professional explanation I just hadn't found yet, or the other kind. I was quiet for a moment. There's a particular feeling of saying something out loud for the first time, something you've known but not said, and the saying makes it more solid than the knowing did. I felt it then. I told her I thought it might be the other kind. She said, okay, just okay. Not dismissive, not frightened, just acknowledging that she'd heard it and was going to sit with it rather than react to it, which is the thing about Sarah I've valued most since she was old enough to do it. She said she loved me and we hung up. I went back to the work table and I looked at the samples in their trays. The rock that had formed around something that was already there. The contact mark that recorded the perfect curve of something that had been sitting in the dark at 12 miles depth since before the continent above it had solidified. I picked up the final core sample and held it in both hands. The contact surface caught the light the way smooth things catch light, a faint curved gleam along the indentation, a record, a physical impression of a surface that was perfect before it was touched and was presumably still perfect after, unchanged by a drill bit that had left marks on everything it had ever touched before. I was holding the first physical evidence in the history of human investigation that something had been here before here existed. I set it down carefully. I turned the workroom lights off and went to bed. I didn't sleep. I filed my report. I documented every finding with the same precision I brought to every report, every measurement stated to the limit of my instruments, every test result described and sourced, every anomaly catalogued and described without editorializing. I stated what the samples showed. I stated what the analysis found. I stated what the dating result meant. I stated what the geometry calculation produced. I didn't speculate in the report. I didn't offer conclusions about origin or implication. I'd been hired to describe what the sample showed, and that's what I did. I sent it to the project account and received an automated acknowledgement. No human response came. The account went quiet the way Bram had said. It went quiet after Perry, and I had expected it to, and it still felt like a particular kind of door closing. I kept my own copy of everything, the original report, all the raw data files, the measurement records, the spectroscopic results, the dating results, all of it, backed up in 3 separate locations, because I didn't know who or what might eventually want to know what I'd found, and I wanted there to be a record that survived any single point of failure. I thought about Perry for several days before I did anything about it. I had his contact information, and I wrote the email in my head a dozen times, and each version either said too much or too little, until I found the version that said exactly what needed to be said, which turned out to be very simple. I told him I'd worked on the same project. I said I thought I understood why he'd gone quiet. I said I hoped he was doing okay. I didn't ask him to write back. I just wanted someone who knew what I knew to know that I knew it too. He wrote back 4 days later. 2 sentences. He said he was okay and that he'd gone to stay with his sister's family for a while and was slowly finding his way back to normal. He said the part that he couldn't stop coming back to was the dating result. I wrote back and said I knew. We left it there. I think about the sphere a great deal. I think about it the way I think about anything I don't have a classification for, which is from every angle I can find, pressing at the problem from different directions until I either find the way in or exhaust my angles and have to accept that the object is larger than my framework for understanding it. The sphere is larger than my framework. I keep finding the edge of what I can think about it and pressing against the edge and finding that the edge doesn't move. It was placed there before the planet was a planet, before the rock above it existed, before any of the processes that made this planet what it is had begun. The rock above it had spent 4.5 billion years moving, the continents forming and breaking apart and grinding into each other, and the crust folding and the mantle churning underneath it all. And the sphere hadn't moved. Not an inch. Everything above it had moved, and the sphere had stayed exactly where it was, a fixed point of impossible stability in 4.5 billion years of geological chaos. 12 miles is not a coincidence. I've thought about this carefully. 12 miles is deep enough that nothing from the surface reaches it. No erosion, no tectonic exposure, no drilling program until this one. Deep enough that it would survive any surface event, any mass extinction, any geological upheaval the planet could produce, but not so deep as to be unreachable by a civilization that had developed the technology to try. Exactly deep enough to wait. I don't know who for. I've tried to sit with that open question and not force it toward an answer it isn't ready to give me. The way you sit with a difficult problem in your work and let the data accumulate before you draw a conclusion. The data I have doesn't point to an answer. It points to a question so large that the answer, whatever it is, would need a framework I don't have and possibly couldn't build. The sphere is still there. Nobody's going back for it. The consortium is silent, and the project account will close eventually, and whatever official record exists of the borehole will be filed somewhere and probably not looked at again. The sphere will sit at 12 miles depth in the dark, and the heat and the pressure, exactly where it's been since before there was ground above it to be below. I keep coming back to the crystalline orientation. It's the finding I can't set aside, not the density, not the geometry, not even the dating result, though all of those are extraordinary. The crystalline orientation in the surrounding rock is the thing that keeps pulling me back because of what it implies. The sphere had been influencing the rock forming above it for 4.4 billion years. Quietly, subtly, in a way too small to notice, without a core sample from directly above it, and an analyst who knew what to look for. The planet cooling, and the rock solidifying, and the crust forming above it, and the whole geological history of a world playing out above this object. And the whole time, from the very beginning, the sphere had been doing something to the material around it. Not aggressively, not damagingly, something more like what I'd call preparatory if I were writing it in a report. Though I didn't write it that way in the report because I didn't know how to justify the word in a professional document. But that's what the crystal orientation data looks like to me. Like something was being prepared. I think about what a set table means. That image came to me one night and it won't leave. A set table, everything arranged and in its place. Plates and glasses and silverware laid out at precision for a meal that hasn't happened yet. A set table means someone is expected. It means whoever set the table knew someone was coming and made things ready. I try not to follow that thought to where it wants to go. Sarah called last Sunday and we talked for an hour about Portugal and her project and whether I'd thought about taking any time off this winter. She sounded good. She sounded like herself, grounded and warm, moving through a conversation about ordinary things with the uncomplicated ease of someone whose world still makes sense to her. I want it to keep making sense to her. I do my work, jobs come in, and I examine the samples, and I classify what I find, and I write my reports. The work is the same. The rock is the same. My instruments are the same instruments they've always been. I just know now what they're sitting on top of, what everything is sitting on top of. 12 miles below the surface, below the geological record my entire profession uses as its foundation for understanding what the planet is and how it formed. There's a perfect sphere of material that has no classification and no origin in any natural process and no equal in anything human beings have ever made. It's 230 feet across, and it's denser than any substance in any reference I've ever consulted. And it's been there since before the crust above it existed, influencing the formation of that crust for 4.5 billion years, doing something to the material around it that I can measure but not fully explain. And it's still there, still perfect, still, doing nothing that would register on any instrument pointed at it from the surface, nothing that would appear in any geological record that didn't include a borehole going straight down to it. Just there, just waiting. If waiting is the right word for something operating on that timescale, which I don't think it is, but I don't have a better word, so waiting is what I'm left with. I think about what it's waiting for, and then I think about whether we're the answer to that question. Whether the civilization that eventually developed the technology to drill 12 miles down and pull up a core sample and find the contact mark was always going to be the civilization that did exactly that. Whether that was always the point. I don't let myself finish that thought all the way to the end. I go to bed. I get up. I go to work. The sphere is still there, 12 miles down, perfect and still and patient in a way that patience is nowhere near the right word for. And somewhere, in whatever form it exists in now, whatever placed it there 4.4 billion years ago, before the ground above it was ground, knows exactly where it is and knows that we found it. That's the part I can't put down. Not the sphere, not the age of it, or the density of it, or the geometry of it, or what the rock around it suggests it's been doing for longer than complex life has existed on this planet. The part I can't put down is simpler than any of that. Something placed it here and knew we'd find it. And now we have.